To begin with the diplomatic setbacks that he received, the summit over the last few days was really billed as an opportunity for Putin to kind of demonstrate that he had significant friendships by large powers in Asia as he pivots towards the region in the context of Western diplomatic isolation. And particularly the fact that China and Russia recently, in February, signed this, quote, no limits partnership agreement. However, really, we didn't see anything really indicating that we would see that kind of level of friendship. In fact, we saw a very sheepish-looking Putin that felt that he sort of had to publicly explain himself to the Chinese president through making a public acknowledgement of the comments and concerns that China had over Russia's war in Ukraine. So I think the fact that he felt that he had to do that publicly rather than privately indicates really the extent of the concerns that China has to do with Russia's actions in Ukraine. But I think it also, to some extent, shows that there is a limit to the supposed no-limits partnership agreement. And that really indicates that actually, even though China and as well India are not willing to impose costs on Russia because of the war in Ukraine, they're also not willing to pay costs themselves. And so basically they're ensuring that through their actions they don't receive any kind of secondary sanctions from the West. So what we're seeing, instead of sort of primary support, we're seeing secondary support through the increase in oil and gas exports from Russia to both China and India. And in doing so, that really allows them to kind of provide that sort of support, but also do it in a way that is not going to harm their economies. But I think it is quite difficult, particularly ahead of the G20 summit, for Putin not to be able to demonstrate that he's got those significant friendships really in place where he wanted them to be, at least. In terms of the actual ground setbacks, I think they're very significant, both operationally, but also from a sort of morale perspective as well. The fact that the Ukrainians managed to take 6,000 kilometers worth of Ukrainian territory that was occupied by Russia in such a short amount of time is really an indication of the growing strength of Ukrainian forces, supported by Western weapons and, of course, their own mobilization, but also the kind of weakness and Russian military intelligence failures that we've seen, but also Russian military failures themselves. I mean, their forces are clearly depleted, their supplies are clearly running out. And, generally in war and conflict, it's significantly easier to defend land than it is to take it. So I think the fact that they've managed to take so much land back in such a short amount of time is really very significant in terms of where the momentum is going on during this conflict.
The Russian leader saying that, well, if Europe wants more gas, it should lift the sanctions, denying that Russia has anything to do with Europe's energy crisis. What do you make of that?
Well, I think, this is partly reflective of the fact that Putin simply doesn't have that many options, in terms of what he could do to try to ratchet up the war effort to increase chances of some kind of Russian victory. He could force a full mobilization, but really that would take several months to do. And so really he's trying to play this diplomatic energy game to kind of force pressure on European consumers that would ultimately lead to pressure on European governments through basically trying to link, the cost of energy that consumers are paying in Europe to their support for Ukraine. And I think ultimately we might see a much more significant intervention from Russia in this in the winter, of course, when Western and consumption of energy is much higher. But I think it's very difficult to see Western support totally buckling. And clearly, the West has indicated that it is willing to pay a price economically for supporting Ukraine. And of course, we see Russia try to mitigate some of the impacts of the reduction in the use of Russian oil and gas through trying to support its own pipelines and formalize its pipeline agreement that it has in Asia. Just a couple of days ago, the Russian foreign minister said that the pipeline that they are planning to build through Mongolia would actually fully replace Nord Stream 1. So I think clearly we're trying to see this kind of shift in momentum from ties between Russia and the West to between Russia and ties in Asia. But at the same time, Russia knows that these ties can't be rapidly forged. So it's really trying to exert any kind of influence over energy that it possibly can in Europe.
Let's also talk about the domestic pressure that the Russian leader is facing at this point. Some of the staunchest supporters of this operation of Russia in Ukraine are calling for the Kremlin to scale things up. There's also that voice note that was sent out by the hardline Chechen leader, Ramzan Kadyrov, lambasting the Russian generals for the mistakes that, according to him, have been made on the ground.
Well, I think just beginning with the final point, I think any kind of criticism of any senior figures in Russia is very significant. And of course, you know, you're not openly allowed to sort of publicly criticize Putin. So instead, they sort of go indirectly through blaming generals. And we know there's been quite a high turnover of generals in Russia itself. So that's really a way that they can internalize criticism, but without sort of compromising themselves. But I do think, you know, it's worth noting that, you know, generally when we've had leaders deposed in Russia, you know, over the last 100 years or so, it's really not been from sort of a mass civil uprising, but rather the sort of ruling class supported by the wider masses. And so I think, you know, the most important thing in terms of trying to understand opposition to Putin in Russia is actually, you know, who feels sufficiently confident that they're able to speak out against him. And that's why, you know, we've seen various local representatives in St. Petersburg and I believe in Moscow as well, speaking out against Putin and even calling for him to be to face charges, which are, of course, very, very significant. I think that is also keenly watched by China, of course, as a very strategic partner to Russia, so actually to see which way it's going, because ultimately China doesn't want to, you know, sort of tie its fate to a leader who they think may not be around in a few months or even a few years. So I think it's, you know, so important for Putin himself to still try to indicate that he's not facing any kind of internal opposition. So I think really the point when things could move very, very quickly is when we see a sort of momentum within Russia itself and lots of people, let's say the ruling classes, who see Putin as a strategic threat to Russia itself.
Adam, we are leaving it there for the moment. Thanks very much for being here.